Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and today we're going to be doing a bit of an interesting deck building fundamentals video, talking about card ratioing. Okay, so there's actually a lot of depth going on here, but basically the idea is that it's surprisingly easy to be able to pinpoint how well refined a deck is in general, just by looking at the amount of each card in the deck. Without even looking at any of the cards in the deck, you can typically have a pretty general idea of how refined the deck is. How do you do that? Well, refined decks tend to follow a pattern of, a certain amount of 3-ofs, a certain amount of 2-ofs, and a certain amount of 1-ofs within certain ranges. And basically, in this video, we're going to talk about, why this exists, what you should, do about this in your decks, how this is going to affect your deck building, and about a bit of a misconception I think a lot of people have about one-ofs in particular. So all the numbers I'm going to mention from this point on are going to depend from game to game. They're going to be a little different, but the fundamentals are all going to be the same. In general, the idea is as a deck gets more refined, it typically has less copies of 2-ofs and 1-of cards. And a really good rule of thumb, there's, obviously many exceptions to every rule of thumb, but typically, refined decks are going to have 4 or less 2-of cards, and probably 2 or less 1-of cards as well. This kind of distribution might seem backwards at first to a lot of people that are coming into card games, but the idea of it is that effectively deck building is a lot more about kind of trimming fat or cutting down in areas where you don't need rather than anything else. With a pretty large deck size that you're only drawing about like halfway through of, on your average game, you're seeing about half of your deck. If there's a card you really want, that needs to be 3 copies, and cards that even if you only really want to draw one of that card, you still kind of need 2 copies to increase your odds of drawing that 1-of copy in that situation that you want. So we can jump into some random lists as we explain more as well. Let's look at the Hype's Teemo Aggro. This is a list made by my boy Hyped. This was a pretty early version. I think he made some tweaks from this point, but you can see, it's going to follow this rule fairly well. There's 1-of, there are 3 2-ofs here, and that's it. 1-of and 3 2-ofs. So in total, there are 11 3-of cards, right? These are your core cards typically, and a card that's like a 3-of in your list is kind of core to your general strategy, right? And I think that the rule of thumb goes on to say that effectively when you look at like a lot of refined lists in Runeterra, and if you actually look at a bunch of lists now that a lot of people consider to be good lists or lists that are well built, especially by a lot of like veteran card game players, typically they are going to have a lot of 11 core cards. 11 is kind of almost a sweet spot in terms of core cards. So 11 different core cards means 33 of your deck slots are committed to that. And then you've got, of course, 7 cards that are going to be split between 2-ofs and 1-ofs, right? Let's check out this buff spam. I'm just clicking on random decks. This might actually be an outlier, and it is. So this is a this is a deck that I'm actually building kind of in progress. And let's kind of take a look at this rule and how it breaks down this list. So right now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 2-ofs, and we've got 3 1-ofs, right? So what that means is we only have 9 core cards. We only have 9 3-ofs to fill out the 40 card list. And again, there's going to be some exceptions, here and there, but in general, this is the kind of like pattern that makes me look at this deck as something that in all likelihood I would probably need to refine a bit further. Like, for example, what is the general probability that I'm going to want like 1 Judgment and 1 Battle Fury, right? Pretty important to effectively consider. The only reason you would want 1 of each is effectively under the circumstances where you are drawing both of the cards and want the option to play either, right? If you think about it that way, whichever one I'm going to want as a finisher should just be a 2-of instead of both of them being 1-ofs. Right, it comes down to consolidation and making sure your deck is kind of playing consistently within its goals as a way to explain it. And that's kind of why this pattern exists. So in general, well-refined decks are often going to be 11 core cards or more. And I would say as a broad rule of thumb, but this is almost always going to be true, don't go below 10 core cards. So 10 core cards is 30 cards total dedicated to 3-ofs, 10 different 3-ofs with 10 like flex slots remaining, right? And that brings me to my final point, which is if 3 ofs are your core cards and 2 ofs are your kind of more situational cards, what are 1 ofs for? And that's kind of an interesting question that I actually think a lot of people answer a little bit wrong. So let's actually jump into our hypergeometric calculator to talk about this more. So basically the idea of a 1 of card, I think a lot of people immediately look at 1 of as a card, well, okay, so if a 3 of is, you know, a 3 of is kind of your core card and 2 of is semi-situational, and 1 of should then be super situational, right? And that's almost always not really how it ends up going. And I'll kind of explain why with the math here, but typically, the idea behind it is you're drawing so much into your deck such that if you're going to have, you know, you're running decks with powerful cards and you're putting cards in your deck with purpose. So the idea of having a card that is a little unfortunate if you draw 2 of them and there's a situation where you can't really find a use for both, then it's okay to kind of eat that minor loss in those situations to double your odds almost of drawing the one you want. Right, so let's go ahead and go into the population size of a Runeterra deck is going to be 40 cards. Sample size depends on how you do it, but let's say by turn 3, you know, you've got 9 cards drawn so far. I like to just kind of start with 9 because turn 3 is kind of a pivotal point of the game for most games. It's like sometimes you need cards early, sometimes you need them late. And if you're mulliganing 2 cards, by turn 3, you'll have looked through 9 cards of your deck. But for this case, let's just make it 10 to make it a little bit easier, but it's going to be the same point, right? Successes in population 1 and 1 for successes in sample. So this is your odds of drawing exactly 1 card if you have a 1 of, and as you can see, the math behind this is very straightforward. It's 25% because it's in the top 25% of your deck, or it's not. So then the further question is, okay, so if you've got 2 of that, you know, what are the odds of drawing 1? Well, it's quite a bit higher. Obviously, I mean, it almost doubles. Naturally, 44%. But I think a lot of people look at 1 ofs as like a really dangerous card. Like, you really don't want 2 of these cards. They're so situational or something like that. And typically the problem with that is basically the idea behind, you know, the odds of drawing exactly both, right? So let's do 2 population and 2 in sample. And we get really low number, 5.7%. So yes, if you have like a 2 of a situational card, there's a really low % chance that you'll draw both of them. And on top of drawing both of them, you know, then we're going to talk about basically, is it a situation where you can't find a use for both of them, which is even lower than this, right? Basically, right? So the idea effectively is if you've got a situational card, if it's worth putting in your deck as a 1 of, it's probably worth putting in your deck as a 2 of, right? That's the general idea behind it. There are a couple exceptions to this, and we're going to get into those. So the one exception is when you have cards that are going to be in the late game. You know, you've got big late game bombs. These are things like Tryndamere or Commander Ladros, right? You know, those are going to be in the late game. You know, this is turn 4 at 10. Maybe you've got a deep mulligan or something. So, you know, late game situation, you could be digging like 17 cards deep into your deck. Let's even say at 18, maybe you've got like Avaros and Sentry or something to pull more cards of your deck. So, you know, when you're talking about like late game scenarios, you know, and you're just looking for a 1 card, it's pretty high at 45. And then when you look at the, you know, 2 of, it's a bit high, but then the problem is when you go for the 2 and 2, the chance of drawing like both of them is a little too high, and you know, sometimes they can really break out, right? This is a lot more scary than, you know, that 17% when you draw both of these. You know, obviously the game is later, so it's kind of okay if you're drawing them both later, but typically you do not want to be bricked out with 2 big cards in hand. So cards like Tryndamere and cards like Ledros that are big proactive bombs, especially because you can tutor them with Battling Bjerg, etc. These are going to be more so like actual like true 1 of cards, more so than 2 ofs in a lot of cases. But there's another category of a 1 of card, and I think it comes down a lot to figuring out other ratios you might want. So oftentimes, the true nature of a 1 of copy of a card is not so much in and of itself representing that card. Think of it not as a representation of the card that it is, but what it offers as a card. So for example, it could be a 3-mana card, it could be a proactive play, it could be a combat trick, whatever niche you're trying to fulfill, right? And the idea is, depending on how smooth you want your curve to go, let's take a look at this deck that we looked at before, and let's look at our 3-drops. We've got, Fiora Brown. This is a weird example. Maybe this is not necessarily accurate. This is not a refined version of the deck, and that's what I'm using this principle to point out, that you can look at this deck and you can immediately tell it's not refined, right? But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you have a bunch of Fioras and you have a bunch of Browns and you play a bunch of games, and for some reason you come to the conclusion that 6 3-ofs isn't enough, right? Just based on how you're playing it out, maybe you want a 7th 3-of. Sorry, 3-of. I meant 3-drop. This is confusing. I messed it up. 3 drops, not 3-ofs. Sorry. 6 3-drops is not enough, and you want a 7th 3-drop. Again, this exact example is a bit unrealistic, but now you see where I'm going with this. So when you think of a 1-of in a lot of situations, it's either going to be a very late game situational card, depending on like how far you're thinning. Maybe you've got some minor tutors for it, like Tryndamere or Ledros, or it might be not really a representation of itself, but rather as a 7th copy of something else you want, right? But, anyway, this is just basically a video showing the concepts. It is a rule of thumb, keep that in mind. There will be some exceptions, but they will be pretty few and far between, to be honest. When in doubt, if you're looking at a deck, whether you're looking at your own deck, you're looking at a friend's deck, you're looking at a net deck, if you see, a bunch of, 2s and 1s and fewer than 10 3-ofs, core cards, this is likely a unrefined deck. Does that mean that the concept the deck is playing for is bad? No, maybe it's a good concept, but it's probably a little unrefined, and some of the ratios need to be adjusted for it to reach its full potential. Alright guys, let me know if you want to see me do kind of a breakdown or my thoughts on anything in particular. Would actually be fairly helpful, because I've got some other ideas. There will be more videos, but I'm actually running out of ideas. So I need you guys to help me come up with more for these videos.